Few things puzzled the soldiers and tacticians of history as much as the question of how to win a battle. Jean de Bueil, a French soldier and admiral who lived in the 15th century, came up with an interesting answer for the Middle Ages. To win a battle, it was essential to stay on the defensive, because the army that attacked was always at a disadvantage. Let's take a closer look at what he meant by this and consider its practical implications for warfare in the Middle Ages. To illustrate, let's start with an example. On the 25th of October 1415, two large armies faced each other on a freshly plowed field near the small town of Agincourt. After a long wait, the English advanced, dug in about 250 meters from the French line, and broke the tense silence with a hail of whirring arrows. The French response was swift. Their cavalry advanced and charged the English line. However, in charging the enemy, they encountered a row of sharpened stakes the English archers had driven into the ground. Faced with fierce resistance from the English, they turned back, throwing the infantry behind them into disarray. The advance slowed and descended into chaos, giving the English archers time to unleash a deadly barrage of arrows. Shortly after the French infantry finally reached the English lines, the two armies came to a standstill. They fought for the upper hand until the English archers on the flanks finally threw themselves into close combat and sealed the fate of the French. Jean de Bueil attributes the French defeat at Agincourt to the fact that the English took a firm position and forced the French to take the initiative by pelting them with arrows. They were forced to either retreat or go on the tactical offensive and undertake the long march to the English lines. As we have seen, this was their undoing. Jean de Bueil cites 6 other examples in which attacking armies experienced similar failures, concluding that, quote, "A formation on foot should never march forward, but should always hold steady and await its enemies on foot. A force which marches before another force is defeated, unless God grants it grace. And, therefore, take up a position as advantageous as possible, and do it early." In addition to Bueil's examples, numerous battles confirm that armies that remained on the defensive had an advantage. Most impressive are the Battle of the Hussites, who repeatedly defeated superior armies of knights thanks to their wagon forts. They rarely took the offensive, instead waiting until their enemies attacked, weakening them and launching a counterattack at the first sign of vulnerability. These examples show that de Bueil was onto something, which is why most historians believe the defending side did indeed have an advantage. The historian Clifford Rogers, for example, discussed this extensively already in a paper back in 1996. Other tacticians have also recognized this. For example, Karl von Clausewitz wrote, quote, "As we shall show, defense is a stronger form of fighting than attack." But why was it so advantageous to remain on the defensive in the first place? 2 factors were decisive. Usually, the defending side had control of the battlefield. The defender could await the attacker in an advantageous position, like on a hill, behind a bottleneck, or in front of marshy terrain. The advantage of choosing the battlefield was sometimes so great that the attackers saw no point in fighting and instead tried to lure the defenders into a more balanced situation or avoided the confrontation altogether. The second advantage of playing defense was that it allowed forces to hold their position. Medieval infantry typically fought in close formations because presenting a cohesive front of spears and shields to the enemy gave them the best chance in battle. The problem was that soldiers who did not regularly train together found it difficult to move in formation. Even the slightest obstacle could become a problem. Rivers, hills, or field fortifications were almost insurmountable. Or even a bush, a large rock, or incoming fire could cause disorganization. And the consequences of a disrupted formation were severe. Christine de Pizan, one of the first French female writers, summarizes them as follows, quote, "Two great evils, says Vegetius, can follow from disordered formation. One is that the enemies can more easily break into it. The other is that the formations may be so compressed that they cannot fight. Thus, it is necessary to keep a formation in ranks and tight and joined together like a wall." Contemporary reports often attribute defeats to the collapse of formations. as seen with the French at the Battle of Agincourt. Both of Christine de Pisan's great evils occurred there. First, the muddy ground and the French cavalry caused the advancing infantry to become disorganized, making them vulnerable to English arrows. Then, the 800 or so men fighting the English on the front line became trapped between the enemy and their comrades. Standing on the battlefield today, it's easy to see why the muddy ground made the French advance so difficult in 1415. The rain that had come down prior to the battle collected at the bottom of the slope, where the English had positioned themselves, turning the battlefield into a muddy quagmire, which severely hampered the knights' ability to maneuver. Seeing the battlefield with your own eyes really gives you a different understanding of what happened on that day in 1415. When I travel to new destinations, such as Agincourt, I always rely on today's sponsor Saily eSIM to keep me both connected and safe. Saily offers an affordable eSIM plan available in over 200 destinations in 8 regions and protects me from accidentally connecting to a foreign network, so I never have to worry about sky-high roaming fees. Saily also makes sure I'm not getting scammed by local SIM card vendors and that my personal data is secure because I don't have to connect to dodgy Wi-Fi networks. With their reasonable pricing, I save around $35 to $45 by choosing their 5GB plan instead of using my local provider. Before I travel, it's easy to select a data plan on their website, download the app and activate my plan before leaving home. Saily is compatible with both iOS and Android devices, offers 24/7 customer support through chat, and provides a full refund if your device isn't compatible with an eSIM for any reason. Don't wait until you're stuck with expensive roaming fees. Solve your internet problems today. Get an exclusive 15% discount on Saily data plans. Use code SANDROMAN at checkout. Download the Saily app or go to saily.com/SandroMan. During battles like Agincourt, medieval soldiers often found themselves trapped between their enemies and their own comrades. Medieval authors sometimes refer to this surprisingly common phenomenon as the press. Soldiers caught in the press struggled to fight due to the immense pressure. In some cases, they were even crushed to death. So the key takeaway from all of this is that if an infantry formation marched toward the enemy, the chance of it falling into disorder was very high, whereas an army that remained stationary could hold its formation easily. If a formation fell into disorder, it was at a significant disadvantage compared to an orderly opponent, and the chances of defeat were high. As a result, the defending side had a clear advantage. Of course, the soldiers and tacticians of the time knew this too. In practice, this imbalance between offense and defense led to attempts to put the enemy in a position where they were forced to take the initiative while remaining in a safe defensive position. This raises the question of why medieval generals would risk an offensive war at all, considering that the attacker was at an inherent disadvantage. The answer may sound simple, but it's not. You cannot achieve an offensive aim with a defensive strategy. To wage a successful offensive war and achieve their objectives, attackers had to take the offensive strategically while ensuring that they held a tactical defensive position during actual engagements. Or, to put it more simply, the trick was to march into enemy territory, but get the defender to attack first. The big question then was how to accomplish this, given that the other side also knew that striking first would put it at a disadvantage. Medieval military leaders came up with solutions that can be simplified into 3 categories. The first option was to provoke the enemy by attacking his honor, for example, by insulting or threatening him. The simplest and most common form of such a provocation was to invade foreign territory. This literal crossing of boundaries was a challenge as clear as a thrown gauntlet. The territorial lord of the invaded area had to react to protect his honor. From a military point of view, it was often wiser to ignore the challenge, but it also carried a significant risk. When Edward III of England led an army into France for the first time in 1339, at the beginning of the 100 Years' War, Philip VI refrained from attacking the invading army. Although this was a sound decision militarily, many of his compatriots considered it cowardice, and Philip's reputation was severely damaged. Many French knights accused him of acting like a fox, renardi in French, calling him dishonorable and deceitful, and publicly showing their disapproval by wearing caps of fox fur. They rejected a ruler who accepted such an insult with impunity. The effect of a provocation was reinforced by symbolic gestures. For example, in 1339, Edward III deliberately entered France on the 9th of October, the feast of Saint-Denis of Paris, the patron saint of the French monarchs. To ensure the enemy could not pretend ignorance of the challenge, he was informed by letter simultaneously. These letters would appear very polite on the surface, while carrying a clear undertone of threat or insult. Their most important aim was to make it clear from the outset that the attacker was prepared to give the defender an opportunity to restore his honor through battle. So they made it clear that it was up to the offended party to take the initiative, suggesting that the lord of the invaded area should abandon the tactical defense to protect his honor, despite being in a defensive position. Henry of Grosmont, the first Duke of Lancaster, formulated such a message as follows, quote, "My Lord Edward of Woodstock answered that he had come into these parts in order to do certain business, which he had now well completed, thanks be God, and was now returning from where he had done it, and if said King Jean of France wanted to disturb him on his way, he would be ready to meet him." The problem with provocations was that they only worked if the offended ruler's sense of honor caused him to ignore the voice of reason. Rulers who managed to keep their cool would usually maintain their advantageous defensive position. Therefore, the attackers tried to frame challenges in a way that refusal would cause the greatest damage to the enemy's honor, such as by portraying him as a coward. A cleverly worded letter left the defender little choice but to react, as adopting a passive stance could do more harm than fighting a battle from poor position. The second option was to pressure the enemy by besieging a symbolically or economically important city. The threat of losing a center of economy and power forced the defender to go on the offensive. Abandoning the city or waiting too long to relieve it could be interpreted as a failure to fulfill his duty as a ruler, or simply incompetence. For their part, the besiegers had all the time in the world and could wait for the anticipated attack in a position of their choice. This approach was used by Edward III when he besieged Berwick in 1333. The siege forced the Scots to abandon their strong position and attack his troops at Halidon Hill. They had to approach the English across a marsh and were mercilessly shot down by their longbowmen. Putting pressure on an enemy in this way was expensive and time-consuming. Important cities were usually well fortified, and the maneuver only worked if the attacker succeeded in bringing the city to its knees. Only when the garrison's situation became dire and the city was on the verge of being conquered did the pressure to come to its aid intensify. It was only then that it became worthwhile for a ruler to take the risk of attacking a besieging force. Henry V had to besiege the French town of Rouen for over 6 months until this point was reached. 6 months that cost him a great deal and were almost as arduous for his men as they were for the people in the city. Much to his chagrin, he then discovered that in some cases a sovereign preferred to give up a city rather than risk a battle. The French did raise an army to liberate Rouen, but ultimately decided not to attack. Pushing an opponent onto the offensive in this way required a certain amount of sensitivity. Sometimes pressure alone was not enough. When Edward III laid siege to Calais, Philip VI did not want to risk a battle, even though the city was strategically critical and on the verge of capitulation. Edward then tried to lure him out of cover by offering to fight on a battlefield chosen by a committee of knights from both sides. Philip refused, because he knew even on an open field, he would be the one under pressure to attack and bring about a decision. As a result, he would still have had to take the offensive, leading to an unfair battle. This example aptly illustrates the interplay between strategic war aims and tactical necessity. Strategically, Edward needed a battle to achieve his goals. Tactically, he wanted to fight on the defensive at all costs. To achieve both objectives, he was even willing to give up his strong position. Philip, on the other hand, made the only sensible decision from a tactical point of view, not accepting the offer. The third way to get a defending army to take the initiative was by plundering. One of the most important methods of warfare in the Middle Ages was the chevauchée, where mounted units plundered the enemy's territory. These raids were very efficient because they not only destroyed the enemy's resources, but also appropriated them for the attackers' cause. Most importantly, the population and economy of the area suffered, which created political pressure on the ruler. At some point, this pressure was so great, he either had to give in to the attackers' demands or confront them in battle. This was the case, for example, at the Battle of Crécy, when Edward III's troops plundered in France in 1346. Philip VI marched against them. The English retreated to the north, bypassed a blockade at the river Somme, and awaited their pursuers on a battlefield where they had a clear advantage. Philip attacked anyway, and the English longbowmen shot several waves of his Genoese crossbowmen and French knights to pieces. Edward had managed to get the French to take the tactical initiative. They went on the offensive and lost the battle. Of course, the side on the defensive did not always win. There were numerous other decisive factors. However, the advantage of the tactical defense was so great that it was an important part of medieval warfare to try to put the other side in an offensive position. The attacker aimed to create a situation where the defender was forced to act by violating his honor, threatening a city, or inflicting lasting damage to the economy and reputation of the sovereign through plundering. The defender sought to prevent this. He wanted the attacker to take the offensive tactically to achieve his goals. In many cases, this was the more challenging task, because the defender had to endure plundering and losses until the attacker gave up on his plan and took the tactical initiative. Invaders usually only did this if they ran out of supplies or something else forced their hand. If a defender held out long enough, every invader would eventually defeat himself, but holding out wasn't easy. The back and forth between offense and defense was a core element of medieval warfare. Therefore, Jean de Bueil was at least partly right. Putting yourself in a tactically defensive position or forcing your opponent in an offensive position was decisive for your chances in a battle. And not only in the 100 Years' War. The imbalance of offense and defense played an essential role in the thinking of great tacticians, like Karl von Clausewitz, throughout history. The Chinese strategist Sun Tzu wrote as early as 500 BC, quote, "Invincibility lies in the defense, the possibility of victory in the attack."